So I've had a long interest in the things that I've done, both before and now, in what I might call public pedagogy. That is, that when culture creates a context in which a public is invited into a conversation that is of urgency to everyone. So one of the things I think a project like Guatemala Después can do is bridge what seems to me to be artificial divides between art and culture on one hand and social or political issues on the other, but they actually begin to make possible a conversation that is just about people talking together about things that concern all of us. So Guatemala Después and the kind of work that's been done, particularly in the ways in which all of the curators of Guatemala Después brought together not only artists but also social thinkers, anthropologists, sociologists, and so on, in a collaborative conversation, seems to be one of the powerful efforts that it brought into being. So it created a conversation amongst the people who were participating in the project, but also in its two editions, one in New York and then one in Sheila, it made possible two different kinds of conversation. In New York at the SJDC, where I am and where I'm the director, it opened up a conversation about Latin America and Guatemala in particular in connection to the United States. So not only a historic conversation of the US intervention in Latin America, which is many years past and ongoing, but it also brought into focus the current relationship and conversations in the United States around migration, around immigration. So it seemed to me to set forth a complex conversation, but within the context of an educational institution, so that it was possible for students and faculty and members of the public to access other kinds of information that were not just in the exhibition. So it becomes a bigger project than just an exhibition. Yes, I feel like art is in the field of culture, culture small c, not culture as in opera, right? Yeah. But culture as a field. I come myself out of a training in anthropology, so I'm interested in the ways in which everyday culture and culture that is, in a way, more deliberately created, like art or artistic practice, how they exist together. And I'm also interested in the ways in which any project can have multiple platforms, so different ways to address people, not to make it kind of dumb down something or not to make it a lowest common denominator, but to conduct a conversation at the highest level of rigor, but that is very inclusive in the ways in which it brings people in. That's that's to me the possible power of art, because art can speak across registers. It speaks across different conversations. You don't have to know about art history in order to be in an engagement. So that kind of the agility of a curator or an artistic project to conduct itself across those platforms, that's the exciting potential in terms of how it can exist in a wider public domain. So the project itself emerged for us at the New School really through the work of Nitin Sahni, who's a colleague of mine and a professor of media studies. And so it was his sort of ongoing work and collaborations with artists and curators and performers in Sheila that, in a sense, was the origin of the project. But I've, through Nitin, and I've begun to know the people at Ciudad and understood a little bit more from my part of the kind of artistic scene in Guatemala. I think that the relationship is inherently not horizontal. And so it's one of the important challenges, I think, in such interactions to maintain the level of kind of a solidarity and a kind of solidarity of alliance that happens through individual people, because the relationship of the US and Guatemala is inherently not horizontal. The relationship of New York to many other places in the world is also lopsided, maybe only in the mind of some people, but still, these are lopsided relationships. So the ways in which individual people can upset these hierarchical relationships of power are very, very important. I think face-to-face, long-standing, sustainable, slow encounter over time is absolutely key. That is, that you develop between people a sense of confidence and trust, and that doesn't happen overnight. Just because Ciudad and the New School collaborate, nothing is changing. It's the sustained interaction of all of us that could change it over time. The impulse of Guatemala Después is that obviously each effort and iteration has its own challenges and struggles. You know, I was there in that panel with Regina, and it was I was raising that question, but not to say that New York is the center of the world, but rather to say what do places that exist in relationships of power that are very different, what does it mean to try to create a different kind of conversation? But you have to engage in that, understanding the power differentials, not pretending that they go away, and actually say what happens when we engage in a different kind of conversations within sort of uneven global differentials. It's not just the art world, right? It's global differentials of power. I think it's a small effort. What I do believe was very valuable, or can be very valuable, is that it was at a university. Universities have many failings, and in this day and age when universities are becoming very corporate, it's even more of a problem. But the one thing a university can do is sustain ideas over time. And that's a very important thing to continue, so that this first proposition by Guatemala Después can continue. Can continue here in Sheila, but can continue in the New School by opening up other kinds of even non-bilateral, that it's not just United States and Guatemala, but it begins to put United States in a different circulation. So it's only one amongst other players. It's one in a different conversation. I think that's a great possibility, and we're not there yet, but it's a nice promise. I'm absolutely in agreement. For me, both when I started Connect and then later in projects that I've done, and because of my own trajectory, which comes out of humanities and social science and has been in the arts for a long time, I've always felt that interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity in self, and even now when I'm teaching students, there is so much misunderstanding in just terminology, vocabulary, ways of working, methodology, that we cannot immediately go to the post-disciplinary phase without understanding that we may not even be speaking the same language. So we're sitting in a post-disciplinary or transdisciplinary context, but it's like we're talking, you're speaking Quiche and I'm speaking, I don't know, something else. So I think one can't jump to that too quickly. That said, I think if you're entering a kind of concern with the kind of contemporary issues of our time, political issues or environmental issues, we need to be beyond narrow disciplinary focus. The problems are so big that if we're stuck in our little, I'm in politics, you're in economics, and we don't speak to each other, that's a grave problem. I think that you have to think very carefully to your question about exhibition design, and I think that the design of projects, not just exhibition design, but the design of projects has to take that difficulty into account. That we are not just transdisciplinary, we're still struggling with the cross-disciplinary questions. And that creates its own tensions. And you have to figure out how a kind of installational project, or how the various, whether you're in a digital platform or a physical platform or some other platform, how that manages to accommodate all these differences but not ignore them. I think it's important to keep visible the fact that some things are unresolved, and that each of those lack of resolution provides a new aperture for another conversation. So it's not to paper over and look beautiful. It's actually to make it a little unsettling. And I think that's really key. So, I'm obviously one step outside the curatorial team, and so but I think that, one of the wonderful things of Guatemala Después is that it brought artists in conversation with kind of non-artists, but who are also scholars and professionals in their own field. The other thing is, I'm not sure if that was a forced marriage. I'm also not sure whether we took seriously the vocabularies and ways of working of the other fields, the non-artistic disciplines, which also have their methodologies. And how do you bring those methodologies, or whether we tried to make it at a certain point into an exhibition, when it actually exists in this world that is, there's a great challenge to take an anthropological or a historical insight and say, how do you make it spatial? And that in itself is a wonderful and very imaginative space. But did we do that? I'm not sure, and it's a good, I think a project cannot do everything, but that would be one direction that I might explore going forward, or that I would encourage people to explore. So I started my work actually my interest is very much on what happens to cities in a moment of crisis. And so my earliest work was actually in Bombay after riots took place. Well, it was then Bombay, now Mumbai, in 92-93. And it changed very much the character of the city. It had, the larger political stories and larger individual stories, but it shifted the way in which the city was seen, and it shifted for the people of that city the ways in which they saw themselves. So I was interested then really in the ways in which people narrate their sense of belonging or their sense of interaction with the everyday life of the city when something very big, when there's been a very big rupture. So that was my kind of originary focus and thinking around sort of urban modernity in South Asia, and particularly around what happens in a kind of post-catastrophic culture. So I thought of it as a culture of catastrophe because I think that catastrophes are not events. Catastrophes are, in a sense, we make them into events. Even if it's a hurricane, we make it into as if there was nothing before and that everything was leading. But you realize there's actually a much bigger social and phenomenological context into which, in a way, a crisis begins to make new forms of, mutates into new forms of meaning. So that's interesting. That was interesting to me. I had lived for many years in New York, even then, and so I was in New York both before and after 2001. So that created for me a very different way of trying to understand how my other city, I'm from Bombay and then I am from New York now, how another city was beginning to transform itself. And so the work that I did after 2001, in about 4 or 5 years after, was a very, very large project called Cities, Art and Recovery, which was really looking at the role of art and culture after catastrophe. How can art and culture begin to enter the ways in which everyday life is, a sort of common sense, how people make everyday sense of their lives in a post-catastrophic context. 2001 being not just a city-based catastrophe, but really one that the United States wreaked on the world, right? So it changed in a way world politics. I also felt that it was a funny moment in which New York had become a very parochial American city, that the United States, which had no interest in New York, suddenly made it very American, but New York has always belonged to the world. So when I did Cities, Art and Recovery, it was a way of saying, let me return New York to the world by inviting people from many contexts around the world. So from Belfast, Phnom Penh, Johannesburg, people who have been thinking, Beirut, people who have been thinking about civil war, kind of ecological catastrophes in their own urban context, and they're using the mechanisms of art and culture to either effect peace, to create new alliances and solidarities, and so on, and to bring them to New York, because New York had so much to learn from the rest of the world. So I do believe projects like that, coming to Guatemala Después, have the ability to open a conversation. I think it's very easy, and this is the risk, it's very easy to turn them into a certain type of memory project. And I think that the trick is to realize that people working in the present are thinking about the future, and the future always has the past, just as the past always has the future in it. So I'm working with some students now in a project that is focused on Cambodia, which, like Guatemala, has had in a sense, a history of genocide. And the students are thinking about kind of futurisms, the futurism of the Khmer Rouge, that, they also had a utopian project, a very diabolical utopian project, but it was a utopian project, right? So it's that tension between, it's not that you remember so you will never repeat. That's very much the rhetoric of memory studies. I'm actually interested in the fact that every moment, the present contains the past and the future contains the past at all times, and the past also contains the future. Not just the future of the present, but a completely new future imagining. And we need to keep all of these in motion to understand what's possible, how we might do some things differently, how we can have completely new forms of imagination. So those are the things that I think are possible in projects like this. Some of it is, you imagine big, and you may never, you might not achieve it, but you have to imagine big, and you have to imagine both in a very large space of the imagination, but in very, very granular, small scale kind of relationship ways. I think that's key. No, because I think that it's memory projects have a dangerous possibility of being hijacked by a very conservative agenda.
Yeah.
So that's that's always, not that it has to be, but that's a difficulty. I'm also very cautious about certain kinds of projects that believe, in this case, this is why Benvenuto's point is so powerful, but I'm very cautious about projects that believe they can give voice to someone, because I was like, you cannot give voice to, we are not in the business of giving, or granting or opening up. And so Benvenuto's challenge, in a sense, it's a statement, but it's also a challenge to the world, that some things, there is a place for voice, there is a place for silence, there is a place for listening, and memory projects often also become noisy projects. And we have to think about, in a sense, we have to think like poetry thinks. That is, there's a space for the word, and then there is just space. And you have to allow that silence. And you have to allow for certain forms of compression that are so compressed that we have to think for a long time about the meaning. I mean, that's why a poem from 1852, a poem from 2002 still can keep you thinking, right? And it's that kind, and artists do that the project is so compressed that it has many, many different possibilities of meaning, and it leaves you thinking, and in that sense it disrupts time, because it can be in the present, even if it was from 2000 BC, right? But it exists in the present with a whole different kind of energy and engagement. That's a big question. I think that's not yes. I feel like I would like to continue the conversations that were started and seeded here. I think there's much to be said to each other. There's much to hear from each other. So I don't know. I can't say that I have an idea of a project, because I think these have to be co-conceived, right? And they have to make sense in a way together. I think that it would be great to find ways in which one can forge new vocabularies. I mean, I'm really interested in the idea of how one finds ways to speak that overturn or disrupt things that we believe we already understand, or the kinds of ways in which people already think that they use words that we all know what they mean, even in the context of artistic engagement. Engagement being one. I mean, I said it, but I think engagement is a question. Collaboration is a question. I don't think I know what these things mean. I think they are, they're created in this dialogue, which I also don't know what that means, right? So I would like to keep talking. I would like to keep that conversation going between people at Ciudad, people in the New School, but also more broadly and in a more individual way, right? Just with individual conversations that have been seeded here, both in terms of the ways in which they've opened up my thinking. So some of the projects here, I would like to continue to think. I'm sitting in front of Benvenuto's work, which I hadn't seen before, and Echar Cal, right? And I only learned how many meanings that has. And so I've been thinking a lot about it since the opening on Saturday. So that's already something that's beginning to seed a kind of question about how shit gets covered, right?
Yeah.
So it's very powerful.
Totally.